New Middle East a year after First Flotilla event. My name is Kilic Kanat and I'm a non-resident fellow here at SETA Foundation. Today we are going to discuss about the impacts of the First Flotilla, which took place after almost, I think, more than a year right now. And we will talk about the impacts of this flotilla to the bilateral relations between Turkey and Israel, and more on the Middle East, and possible impacts of the second flotilla, which is scheduled to sail probably in a couple of days. We have three panelists right now. Noura Erakat, on my left, is the Palestinian human rights attorney and activist. She is currently an adjunct professor of international human rights law in the Middle East at Georgetown University and the legal advocacy coordinator for the Badil Center for Palestinian Refugee and Resident Rights. And most recently, she served as legal counsel for Congressional Subcommittee in the House of Representatives, chaired by Congressman Denis Kucinich. And on my right side, Yigal Schleifer is a Washington-based independent journalist and analyst who covers Turkish foreign and domestic affairs. Between 2002 and 2010, he lived in Istanbul, where he worked as a correspondent for Christian Science Monitor and the German press agency. And he blogs regularly about Turkish politics at istanbulcallingblogspot.com. And last but not least, our very own Nuh Yilmaz, the director of SETA Foundation. You already know him, but he's widely published on Turkey's new foreign policy orientations, U.S. foreign policy, Turkish politics, and energy security. And he's also served as the Washington representative for Turkish media outlets, including Star, 24 Haber, and CNN Turk, and currently serves as the Washington bureau chief for Turkish TV channel ATV. Shall we start? Noura, with you.
Sure. Thank you to Nuh and to SETA for this kind invitation, and good morning or good mid-morning to all of you. I will begin by providing more of an overview, not specifically about Israeli-Turkish relations and regional relations, but taking a step back into what is the blockade, where does it fit in international law, what issues were raised by the flotilla in the devastating attack in May 2010. And then I will leave it to my colleagues to then discuss the political implications of this in bilateral relations and otherwise. So, aside from being a devastating attack last May, the flotilla did something quite phenomenal in the sense that for the first time it raised the issue of the blockade of Gaza to a level of public discourse in places that it hadn't been before. Hither to that moment, the blockade that was imposed on Gaza was something that was almost administratively and nominally condemned within multilateral institutions like the United Nations, but had not been addressed, not for its legal nature or its devastating impact in any detail, and certainly not in public discourse. Because of the raid on the Marmara, what happened at that point is that it did become part of public discourse, and the main question was, is the blockade illegal or not? And this was due to the civilian efforts in order to challenge the blockade that had been imposed on Gaza since June 2007 in its most harsh form. So to take just the history of the blockade and what it had done up until 2010. In January 2006, Hamas was elected into government, had the Palestinian Legislative Council by about 76%, in a vote of 76%. Relations between Hamas and Fatah remained somewhat amicable until June 2007, when those tensions had risen. Fatah had not transferred the jurisdiction and authority of the Palestinian Authority institutions in Gaza to Hamas's control. And in addition to that, there was something of what had been described as a preemptive coup that eventually led to the ouster of Fatah from the Gaza Strip by Hamas in June 2007. Immediately thereafter, Israel declared Gaza a hostile territory, and impose the blockade as a measure to demonstrate or to effectuate its own self-defense. Self-defense here meaning within the legal definition of self-defense, namely as is defined by the UN Charter, Article 2, and its exception in Article 51. The only way for Israel to impose a blockade upon Gaza and to call it a hostile territory, and for that blockade to be legal in international law, is contingent on whether or not Gaza remained occupied territory. Israel asserts that after its unilateral disengagement in August 2005, it effectively ended its occupation because of the withdrawal of its troops and the dismantlement of 21 settlements and the withdrawal of approximately 12,000 settlers, and therefore said that Gaza is now an independent statelet or part of the future Palestinian state and therefore is not under occupation. If that were to be the case, if Gaza is no longer under occupation, Israel is no longer responsible for the civilians living in Gaza. Those responsibilities rise from its duties as an occupying power pursuant to the Fourth Geneva Convention, as well as to several other articles of the Fourth Geneva Convention, including Articles 55, 56, and 57 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and Article 69 of Additional Protocol 1 of 1977. It also shifts the applicable legal framework from the laws of occupation to the laws of two states dealing with one another, meaning that without the presence of an occupation, Israel has the legal right to declare war on Gaza or Gaza if it were a state, and it does not have that same right if Gaza were still occupied, specifically because there would be a clash of two legal frameworks of jus ad bellum, which governs the laws of occupation, and jus in bello, which governs the laws of self-defense. I'm sorry, flip that. Jus ad bellum is the laws of self-defense. Jus in bello would be the laws of occupation and the laws of war. If the occupation no longer exists, then Israel can indeed declare war, including imposing a naval blockade, which it did in June 2007. However, if the occupation continues to exist, Israel does not have that right and continues to have the responsibility and the duty to protect those civilians under its occupation, including the duty to maintain peace and order. Why does this become so crucial? Israel insists that the withdrawal of its troops signaled the end of its occupation, whereas international law finds, by large international consensus or near to international consensus, that the withdrawal of troops did not suffice to signal that end. Specifically looking to how one measures continuing occupation in Article 42 of the Hague Regulations, which presents for us a test of effective control. Effective control helps us determine whether or not occupation exists, not by determining whether or not there is presence of troops, and therefore that thereby indicates the presence of a military occupation, but instead helps us determine that if an occupying power continues to have effective control or the ability to exert that effective control within reasonable time, the occupation continues to exist. And as many scholars have demonstrated, as well as many UN agencies, as I've demonstrated in my own scholarship, that effective control continued to exist because Israel may have withdrawn its troops, dismantled its settlements, but maintained effective control over the airspace, the seaports, the 5 border crossings into Gaza, connected to Israel, as well as control of its electromagnetic sphere, its tax registry, its population registry, and thereby continue to control the ingress and egress of all goods and people. By all means, the occupation continued to exist, which means that the duties of an occupying power continued to be endowed or held by Israel. So in any other situation, it may be able to declare that it had the right to legal self-defense and therefore impose a blockade in this situation and doesn't. And what I'm raising here is something beyond the normal protest of the blockade, which is that it constitutes collective punishment under Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention for punishing the 1.5 million Palestinian person population in Gaza, in saying that regardless of the way that the blockade is imposed upon Gaza, even if it were humane, it would still be illegal, because Israel cannot declare war on the territory that it occupies. To the contrary, it has a duty to protect that territory. If there is no law and order in the territory, which is the reason that it uses in order to impose the blockade and to declare legal self-defense, that lack of order and peace is Israel's responsibility in order to maintain. Which doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have several other means and mechanisms in order to maintain order and to protect itself. To the contrary, it has all the rights enshrined under Article 43 of the Hague Regulations, which are primarily law enforcement policies, but the distinction between law enforcement policies is akin to policing as opposed to military power. And that would be the primary difference. So what has the blockade done? Notwithstanding this limitation on Israel's own power to impose a devastating blockade and to declare war, which, unfortunately, it doesn't have a stated end. Israel has cited several reasons for the imposition of its blockade. The actual cessation of transfer of weapons is only one of the justifications that Israel has used. But it's also cited that this is punishment for the civilian population in Gaza. Former Prime Minister and current Likud leader, Tzipi Livni, has said that how should the children of Gaza sleep while the children of Israel are terrorized by rockets, indicating that this is a form of vengeance and retribution, which under all cases is prohibited under the laws of armed conflict. Or a third reason has been that this is to impose such devastating circumstances upon the civilian population of Gaza that they would rise up to overthrow Hamas's governance, which is also illegal. It has been illegal so long as the laws of war continue to exist in their current form. But Israel wouldn't be the first to use this mechanism. As we've seen, the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia had similar reasoning in targeting the civilian population in order to overthrow their governments or governing regimes. Moving on, what has this blockade meant for the lives of the 1.5 million person population in Gaza, 3/4 of whom are refugees? And so of those 750,000 Palestinians in Gaza who are refugees, who are already somewhat dependent on external aid, primarily from the United Nations Relief Works Agency, for their sustenance, for their employment. What the blockade did was to immediately eviscerate even those dismal conditions rapidly. So consider that before the imposition of the blockade in 2007, there had been 190,000 economic establishments that had provided employment opportunities for the population of Gaza and employed 500,000 individuals. In the aftermath of the imposition of the blockade, that number quickly dwindled, where 90% of those establishments were closed, and a fraction of those employed continued to be employment, so that today, according to Special Rapporteur Richard Falk to the occupied Palestinian territory, unemployment today is now at 42.5%. And 80% of the Palestinian population is dependent on food aid simply for survival. Consider also that in order to meet just the basic needs of the Palestinian population, that you would need 2,800 truckloads of aid a week in order to provide for the population. And before 2007, that quota was met. By January 2010, the truckload had been reduced to 2,500 truckloads in a month, as opposed to a week, in order to meet the needs of the Palestinian population. According to Israel, so long as it's not starving the population, then this is therefore humanitarian. And in fact, pursuant to customary law, Article 59, paragraphs 1 through 3 of the Additional Protocol 1 actually says that no form of warfare can be used to starve a population in order to achieve military ends. And so, almost cynically, or I would suggest insidiously, Israel has maintained a level of sustenance just above starvation, as has been released by new documents that Gisha, an Israeli NGO, was able to obtain, similar to FOIA, by a FOIA litigation, documents that revealed that the government had actually calculated the minimum caloric intake necessary to maintain the Palestinian population just above starvation. And so this is the situation that had existed even before the beginning of Operation Cast Lead, which, as you know, has devastated multiple factories, the government agencies, and so on and so forth. There's no reason to revisit that. All this to say is that the United Nations, rather than challenge this illegality, rather than declare it illegal, has approached this as a moral issue and has chastised Israel for using immoral and counterproductive means in order to protect itself. When from the beginning Israel didn't have the right to impose such a blockade. One, for abrogating the existing legal order. Two, it maintains its duties and responsibilities as an occupying power. And three, of course, what we've often heard is that this constitutes collective punishment pursuant to Article 33. The flotilla emerges in that context. The failure of multilateral organizations to respond to this situation, the failure of governments to impose the pressure necessary to lift the blockade, to urge Israel to lift the blockade. And from this emerges an international movement of civil society and civilians to break the siege, quote unquote, by drawing attention. And by the time the international community paid attention to these efforts, or the Free Gaza movement's efforts, in May 2010, that had been the 6th attempt to break the blockade. There had been several ships that had sailed before, and that was the First Flotilla, or group of ships that had sailed in order to break the siege. And we know that it was attacked fatally. We know that since then, it has been left to the Turco Commission as well as the UN panel of inquiry to decide who has that responsibility. And in the meantime, since then, in the year that's passed, the blockade has not been eased in any meaningful way. The population continues to live on a day-to-day basis, barely above subsistence, and we continue to watch as a collective punishment is imposed upon Gaza, which is a horrible model to be used for warfare, a horrible precedent in armed conflict for the future. I'm happy to answer any other questions after a more thorough discussion of the regional and political implications.
Thank you very much. Don, go ahead.
Great. All right, thank you to SETA for putting this together, having us. Thank you to all of you for coming today on a Friday. I know we're looking back a year, but I actually want to take us back about 9 years ago for some reporting that I did. I was based in Turkey starting in 2002, and I was working on a piece about Turkey-Israel relations just after the AK Party had been voted into power with the war in Iraq looming. And the idea of the story was to look at sort of where will Turkey-Israel relations go. And I went to Ankara to meet with somebody who had been quite influential in setting up the Turkey-Israel relations as we knew them. You know, the height of the Turkey-Israel relations. And we talked, and this person said, you know, Turkey-Israel relations are so strong, we've made them so sound that even the introduction of Sharia law wouldn't shake them. You know, it was one of these kinds of comments that even at the time was obviously, you know, ridiculous. But you know, but I think what we see, you know, from a year ago is that it took much less to shake Turkey-Israel relations, and really that the foundations they were built on were something a lot more flimsy. You know, so despite having these relations that date back actually to the late 1940s, the foundations were not very solid, certainly not as solid as this person who helped build them thought they were. But I think a year after, both Turkey and Israel are still trying to recalibrate, readjust. the relationship, rebalance the relationship, figure out what went wrong, and still trying to figure out how to fix it. It's not clear if they will succeed, and I think what's not clear is what the costs are for both countries, I think regionally also, if they fail in patching things up. But I want to look at the Israeli perspective a year later, and at the flotilla itself. I think from the Israeli perspective, the Turkish participation in the flotilla, particularly the Mavi Marmara and the IHH participation, was a kind of traumatic event, bringing Israelis face to face with a Turkish public anger over the Palestinian issue, Turkish public anger about Israel itself that I think they had never really seen before, and I think forcing Israel to confront the loss of Turkey as a major ally, as its only Muslim ally in the region. I think it also highlighted what has been a continuing misreading by Israeli officials of Turkey, of the AK Party government, and the country's changing dynamics and changing foreign policy. That's something that started once, when the AK Party came into power, and I think the misreading by Israeli officials continued. What brought the two countries together in the late 1990s, of course, was a sense by both countries of being an outsider, a non-Arab outsider in the region. And clearly, since then, the two countries have gone on very divergent paths, with Turkey working to reintegrate itself into the region, while Israel has become increasingly isolated in the region and, of course, still sees itself as an outsider and in many ways is now even more of an outsider with the loss of Turkey as an ally, and I think in recent months the loss of Egypt to a large extent as the kind of ally that it had before. I think another thing that a lot of Israelis and Israeli officials in particular didn't really have a good read on was how closely many Turks linked the relationship with Israel to Kemalism, to military tutelage in Turkey, and I think in the last 8-9 years in Turkey, as we've had a reassessment of Kemalism, of the military's role, I think in many ways Israel has become very much intertwined with the old order, and I think that's something certainly that Israeli officials have not had a good read on. In fact, I was just looking. There was several Turkish reporters are in Israel now doing interviews with officials, and there was an interview with Dan Meridor, one of the Israeli ministers, and he again sort of talked about sort of how much Israel share in terms of Zionism and Kemalism, these two movements that brought together nations in the 20th century. Again, the sense I got from him was I don't think he really has a sense of the changing dynamics in Turkey and how Israel fits into that. But if we look at Israeli society, not so much at the leadership level, I think, again, I want to repeat how sort of profoundly traumatic the flotilla event was, and how much it's helped strengthen what's been I think a dangerous trend in Israeli society of looking at the country as being disconnected, isolated, not part of the region. During the height of the Turkey-Israel relationship in the 1990s, the Israeli perception was that Turkey was this very close friend, a kind of safe haven in a region filled with enemies. And I think for Israelis, the loss of this has really strengthened dramatically this sense of isolation in the region, and I say it's dangerous, because in the sense of if we're looking for solutions in the region, having an Israeli society that feels disengaged, threatened, only strengthens negative trends, only strengthens the hands of a government like what we currently have in Israel, and that of course doesn't work for anyone's benefit. I think also a year later, if we look at Turkey and Israel, I think a lot of what we can see is how sort of exceptionally Turkey has treated Israel. Exceptionally, I mean in the sense of as an exception, not exceptionally well. Very much outside of its zero problems or neighborhood policy. I think, and we can maybe in the questions sort of look at what this is about. But I mean, I think when we look at how Turkey's approached certain other problems in the region, we see a very different approach to Israel. The foreign minister, Davutoglu, for example, very much talks about engaging with peoples in other regions. He has almost a psychological approach, for example, with Syria, with other places, with Iran. The approach has been very much about creating trust, about sort of a more gentler approach, about about really trying to listen and understanding a country's fears and concerns. And I think in terms of Israel, for whatever reason, we've seen a very different approach. And I think that's only intensified over the last year, although maybe in recent days there have been some changes. But I think we've had, obviously there's been very little engagement between the two countries on the governmental level. And obviously in Israel we also have a very difficult government for Turkey to deal with, for other countries to deal with. But I think we've seen very little Turkish effort to engage with other parts of Israeli society. So if we put aside the governmental level, I don't see real efforts to do cultural exchanges, other kinds of person-to-person exchanges, the kind of thing that the Turkish government has tried to do with other countries in the region. In fact, some efforts to do this recently have been forced to have failed or been forced to cancel. We had a musical performance group that was supposed to play in Istanbul that had to cancel. We've had Israeli sports teams that have had to cancel their appearances in Israel. And I think the tenor of the recent election, the recent campaign by the AK Party, where the question of criticism of the government was blamed on Israeli-controlled media, things like this have only again helped sort of strengthen a sense among the public that Israel is a negative force, a dangerous force. So if we look at some of the recent developments, I think obviously there's been some efforts recently to bring the two countries together. What's driving this? I think Turkey's discourse previously, both on the government and the public level, increasingly was painting Israel as the main source of instability in the region. And this increased after the flotilla. But I think in the last few months, particularly after events in Syria, we've seen that Israel is perhaps one of the largest, if not the largest, destabilizing factors in the region, but Turkey now has to deal with other destabilizing factors, some of them much closer to its own borders. And I think concerns over Syria, it was actually concerns over Syria and efforts to check its power that actually brought Turkey and Israel together. That played a large part in it. So it's interesting, I think, now that sort of Syria is again somehow bringing the countries possibly together, but I think that's an open question. But I think a year ago, some people would have made the argument that Turkey, perhaps led forward by the IHH and the flotilla itself, was somehow joining an axis of resistance regarding Israel, and you certainly heard that. But I think a year later, especially with what's happening in Syria again, it's clear that there's other crucial struggles of resistance in the region, and Ankara cannot ignore them and can't appear to be oblivious to them if it wants to maintain its trajectory of becoming a regional power. So I think in many ways this push for the two countries to normalize their relationship right now is not only coming from outside Turkey, particularly from Washington, but it's also coming from influential voices inside Turkey, such as the Gulen movement, which I think seems very interested in having the two countries patch things up. So, but I think it goes to the deeper question of can the two countries normalize their relationship, whatever normalizing means, and we can talk about that. I think at the end of the day, without any significant breakthrough on the Palestinian issue, on the Palestinian front, and I think probably without even the change of government in Israel, I think there's little chance for the kind of normalization that many people are looking for. And I also wonder if Turkey, and I think I'm talking about the AK Party leadership, and particularly Erdogan and Davutoglu, can again normalize, we'll put that in quotation marks, their view of Israel. I think the country, Israel, for them clearly exists in another realm, emotionally, intellectually, politically, ideologically, for both of them, and these are the people who are formulating Turkish foreign policy, and I don't really have a clear sense of how they visualize a future relationship between Turkey and Israel. I think that's still kind of being developed, especially in light of recent events. I think tied into that question is what role does Turkey see for itself regarding Israel and the peace process? I think it's clear how Turkey sees its role with the Palestinians and the kind of role it would like to play in terms of developing Palestinian statehood, nationhood, and unity. I don't have a sense right now of what it really wants for the Israeli side. And I think in that sense, the absence of a positive and engaged Turkish governmental voice regarding Israel on the issue leaves a very large gap in the region, and one that perhaps we can talk about more in the question period. Thank you.
Thank you. No.
Thank you all coming. I hope it's useful event to discuss what was going on in the region 1 year after the flotilla. So I'm planning to focus on more of the structural conditions that prepare the flotilla and what has changed after the flotilla. So I just want to start with saying that I agree with most of the parts of the presentation for Noura and like Yigal. But just one point maybe is important, because mainly in Turkey, foreign policy is a state decision, in the sense that sometimes, time to time, it changes from government to government. But most of the time, I mean, if a decision is made in Turkey regarding foreign policy, it's a state decision. So even if some institutions do not agree with the result or do not agree with the what needs to be happened, but at the end of the day, all the institutions support these decisions. So why do I start with this? I think what's going on in the region is a result of what's going on in Turkey in terms of the state structure and in terms of Turkish foreign policy. So I don't want to give the whole story of Turkish-Israeli relations, but we need to first recognize that Turkish-Israeli relations lived its best times during the 90s. So it started in 1991 and it lasted almost a decade. So this was a special time for both Turkey and Israel, because after the Cold War, Turkey felt that it may lose its importance in transatlantic alliance, and also it felt that, especially after the invasion of Iraq, the Gulf War, there was a Kurdish question coming up from both Syria and Iraq, etc. So then decided to get closer with Israel and to have better relations with Israel in order to deal with these security threats, and also at the same time to acquire some weapons that were basically prohibited by or embargoed by United States because of the human rights issues back in Turkey. So that was the real basis of Turkish-Israeli relations, the strategic relations between the two countries in the 90s. So when we started to see Turkey has been changing in late 1990s, especially early 2000s, almost all of these reasons have been disappeared. I mean, Turkey started a good relations with Syria. The Kurdish question, especially the security part of that question, has been changed. The PKK was under control. PKK's leader was in prison. So most of those reasons have been disappeared. And also, Turkey as a state, even during the Cold War, followed an independent foreign policy, tried to at least keep its profile as an independent power in the region. Whether it was successful or not is a different discussion, but at least Turkey tried to keep that independent profile most of the time. So starting with 2000, especially the recovery period after the financial crisis in 2000-2001, I think Turkey felt a little bit more stronger and tried to go more assertive and more independent in its foreign policy. So to achieve these goals, certain decisions are made, especially starting with the AK Party government. The basis of this foreign policy can be reduced to three important principles: the balance between security and freedom, respect for elections, and free flow of goods and people. So I think these were the basis of Turkish strategy in the region, because Turkish foreign policy made a decision that in order for Turkey to become a more powerful and more independent country in the region, or let's say regional power in the region, it had to first go through an economic boom. It had to go through with more trade, more boosting economy, and also it had to present a different profile by eliminating all the, for example, human rights issues inside, trying to deal with all those human rights records, and try to present a better, more acceptable profile to the outside, which is the basis of the balance between security and freedom. So as a basis of this vision, Turkey started implementing different policies, such as the lifting visas, trying to create common trade zones, trying to get movement easier in the region. More economic activities, more trade, more investment, more tourism. I think Israel as a country was not outside of this schema, and I think it's still not outside of this whole big picture. But the problem was, even though Turkey had many problems with like Iraq, Syria, and almost all of the neighboring countries, the Greece, Bulgaria, solved most of the problems, at least reduced the tension to a workable level, and then introduced these different mechanisms to allow more interaction and more exchange in the region. But there was, I think, one block to this whole policy that was basically Israel. I mean, not because Israel was against this policy, or not because Turkey was anti-Israel or Israel was anti-Turkey, but the thing is, Israel did not want to support this free movement of people because of the blockade, because of the West Bank, Gaza, and all that occupation thing. And Israel did not really want to see more economic integration in the region because of the blockade in Gaza again, and because of the, again, like intricate situation inside Israel. And also Israel did not want to really go forward with elections because of the Hamas issue, because like Hamas elected to power, and it was not the best condition for Israel. And also Israel did not want to really try to balance the security and freedom because it felt more and more threatened and more isolated, and did not even thinking about freedom of the others inside in the like occupied territories. So I think the main reason of this conflict is not the conflict between the two countries, but the conflict between the two different regional policies, two different regional strategies. Turkey has been trying to implement a different strategy which really clashes with Israel's position. So if you look at the issue from this perspective, Turkey get more active, more vibrant society, vibrant economy, vibrant civil society. And at some point, look, this was discussed last year, whether IHH